Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
In this hour, we will go behind the scenes in the Middle East with Roy Hange. He is live in studio. And Roy, welcome to the program. I'm glad you're here, man.
It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much for coming by. You have worked for many, many years, spent your adult professional career working with NGOs in the Middle East and elsewhere. Is that right? Can you give us a quick sketch?
I spent a total of 10 years in the Middle East, 3 in Egypt, 6 in Syria, and 1 year in Iran.
And doing what specifically?
I was there with Mennonite Central Committee, the Relief Development and Aid Organization that also does peace building in various parts of the world, including the Middle East.
So you really have spent quite a bit of time in these countries that most of us only read about and see pictures of on the news.
I lived there a total of 10 years and have been tracking the region and religion and conflict for about 30 years.
Yeah. So one of the places that you lived and you worked for a while there was in Syria, which is making headlines today because of the civil war. And, following the Arab Spring, there was a certain subset of the population in Syria that made an effort as well to participate in the Arab Spring by having a revolution against the Assad regime. Let's explore that. Let's unpack that. What's your read on that? And help us understand from your perspective as somebody who works in the Middle East, what do Americans need to understand? Somebody driving in their car right now, sitting at home here in America, Syria pops up in the news. What should we understand about what's happening there? And the reason I'm asking is because it's very likely that Americans will die in Syria, given the current leadership we now face, who seem eager to get in on this stuff going on around the world.
Before the Arab Spring, there were various other attempts to create a more open government in Syria in 2006, not long after the current President Assad came back from England to run the country. A group of folks gathered to have more open conversations and begin civil society and democratic processes. Amr Abdul Hamid, the son of a famous actress in Syria, was central to some of those efforts, but then those were shut down within about a year. And later in the Arab Spring, there were movements to begin social protests, mostly nonviolent at first, and then they edged into violence after certain catalytic events cranked up the intensity of the encounters between those who wanted change and those who resisted change.
Who are the people who are fighting Assad? Because I've read elsewhere that, people saying, why are we there? There's nobody there that likes us on either side, on any of the sides in this struggle, these wars going on in Syria as we speak. There's really nobody there that would have American interests at heart here. So what are we doing there?
The opposition groups in Syria run across the spectrum from more secular democratic groups to very militant jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda and Islamic State fighters. In the beginning of the conflict, there was a broader range of groups present, and for the most part now, the more radical Muslim organizations like the Al-Qaeda umbrella group and Islamic State control most of the opposition militant forces, not all of them.
So we're arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS-leaning groups in Syria?
Not directly. There have been statements by various observers that the U.S. armed and trained militias that would either come in from Turkey or from Jordan would last a few days to a few weeks before their weapons would be taken over, or they would join one of the militia groups of various types. And there are also more centrist Muslim militia groups, but they would be associated with Gulf Arab state funding, mostly Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
So who is Assad? Help us understand this guy. He's Russia's guy, right? In Syria. You've been in the room with him. What is he like? What do we need to know to understand him?
He's a reluctant president. He came to power after he was called back from England. Soon after, his brother Basil died while driving to the airport in Damascus in his Porsche, flipped the Porsche one foggy morning and caused a political crisis because he was supposed to succeed his father. When the current president Assad came to power, he did not have much political aspiration to do that. He came out of a role as an optometrist in England, and he was primarily managed by those who were working with his father, the president, and much of that management dynamic continues today, according to some commentators. So he is a reluctant presence at the top of that political pyramid, which has been a highly controlled police state for decades, for at least 40 years.
And when we say police state, the military and the government's police are one, or are they separate?
Most of the high-level officers in the military branches and in the various branches of the secret police are from the Alawite clan, which, according to historians who track what happened after World War I, when the French empowered the minority Alawites into officer corps training, those Alawites eventually, when Syria got independent from colonial French rule, controlled the military structures, similar to a way the minority groups in Iraq were the Sunnis under Saddam Hussein, and they were empowered by the British. So one of the colonial European techniques was to empower minorities and therefore create fragile states. And so what we've seen in the Middle East lately is a series of fragile states losing the minority, mostly dictatorial leadership.
Yeah, as you say, going back to World War I and Sykes-Picot and the intentional effort on the part of Britain, France, and Russia, and America was in a little bit to purposefully create these fragile states in the Middle East that would pose no threat to their neighbors, right? To keep them destabilized, to keep them arguably in civil wars, internal civil wars.
It was a practice of most colonial European powers at the time. Also in Africa, the Belgian and French created minority groups to control majorities. The struggle also in various parts of the Gulf Arab states is the British-backed monarchies. So one of the initial rulers before Saddam Hussein in Iraq was a king put in place in cooperation with British powers. And King Hussein of Jordan, King Hassan, is still in that line of monarchy.
But that whole modus operandi that we saw out of World War I with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and have we reached a point in the story of the Middle East where all of that is collapsing? Or is it still pretty much where we see where these dictators run everything and often represent minorities in these countries, and there's really no hope for democracy?
There were various agreements worked out in the 1920s related to the Sykes-Picot process, where the French and British divided up the Middle East in various control zones. After World War II, when the United States came out on top along with the British, they divided up oil reserves by country. The British got Iran, the U.S. got Saudi Arabia, and those were agreements made between presidents. You can read Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize, to get the details of that arrangement. So both at the colonial control level in the 1920s and the control of oil resources that began after World War II, the Arab world and Muslim world has experienced a pattern of significant manipulation by Western powers for mostly Western powers' economic interests. So I lived a year in Iran in 1953. There was a coup against the Iranians' first democratically elected government under the Mossadegh regime because he was attempting to nationalize the oil revenues, and he was pushed back. The Shah, the king, was put back in power and stayed there until 1979.
American corporations didn't like that. American and British corporations didn't like that.
There are various interpretations of what happened at that time.
Yeah. So just to circle back to Assad, where is he on the scale of evil dictators? I mean, you look at a place like North Korea, where people disappear all the time, and we know for a fact these huge camps of dissidents where they keep people in these, for lack of a better phrase, concentration camps, and they arrest and detain people who speak out against the regime. What's the story in Syria?
It's been observed by many who've been in the country and have written about it that the police state that Syria is a attempt to hold together a broad spectrum of religious, ethnic, and minority groups under minority Shiite Alawite leadership, Alawite Shiite splinter group called the Alawites. But the Sunni majority in the country is also split between those who know that if a radical Sunni government were to take power through one of the current militias, there would be more chaos than there is now. So that for the last at least 20 years and 30 years, there's been an understanding that the state is so fragile that change could result in chaos, a Somali-like state of political and
armed gangs, basically.
Chaos. There are armed gangs basically running the country now, even under the Assad regime, where there are so few troops, so many young men have left the country, and so many have avoided the draft by one means or another that the Assad regime, to maintain control of areas they've retaken with Russian aid, have basically commissioned some armed gangs who primarily work at controlling that region on behalf of the Assad government. And those are not opposition militia fighters, but they don't have as much centralized authority as the Syrian government forces would.
You've said that when you lived in Syria, it was actually a very safe place. Is that a comment on the fact that a police state can actually be a safe place if you just stay in color inside the lines?
It was a very safe place from the consideration of public security and crime. My wife felt comfortable walking the streets at night alone. It was well known that many taxi drivers were secret police working on the side, and they'd have a revolver under the seat. And I've been in a car, or the police, I've been in a taxi when they've been pulled over and go to an event and leave me sit there waiting. So the reality is that to maintain the control needed for a minority group to run Syria, it was fairly repressive, very repressive, and it alienated a lot of people, especially the Muslim majority who are Sunni, and they were repressed, especially in the early 1980s when the Muslim Brotherhood attempted a revolt, and that was brutally crushed in a number of locations, especially Hama.
So Assad isn't the kind of leadership we might see in a place like Iran, where you have a religious fundamentalist in controlling the apparatus of the state. It's more like a Saddam Hussein when he was in power. It's the Baathists. They're seculars. They believe in the separation of church and state.
The Baathists had a secular state model, which was very dictatorial, but included structure and honoring of different religious and ethnic minorities, similar to the way the Turkish Ottomans had a millet system, where each of the minority groups had their own civil court structures, and that exists still today in the under the Assad regimes, both his father and the current one, where divorce and some low-level economic concerns are dealt with by religious courts in their respective communities.
So, connect the dots for us here between like Russia and Putin and Syria and Assad. What do we need to understand about that relationship what Putin wants?
Yeah, one of the more interesting articles I've read about the history of the war is Robert F. Kennedy's Jr.'s online article on Politico.com on Why the Arabs Don't Want Us in Syria is the title. He tracks the history of various initiatives to put gas pipelines across Syria. So Qatar, a Gulf Arab Sunni state, wanted to put a gas pipeline into the Mediterranean across Syria in the early 2000s. Russia, who has a sort of monopoly on gas sales into Europe, convinced Syria to say no. This created significant pushback to the degree that the Qataris started stirring and Saudis started stirring ways to get Assad out of power, which eventually became some of the support for the initial opposition group. Another complicating factor is that the Russians have been a traditional protector of Syrian forces and have had a naval base on the Mediterranean coast, which has been recently increased since 2015 when the Russians became more actively involved in the current civil war. The other pipeline stories in the situation are that Iran wanted to export its own gas supplies across now Shiite-controlled Iraq and Syria into the Mediterranean, And that was resisted because that would empower that Shiite arc. And then Turkey and Israel have been exploring cooperation about some kind of gas export from the significant Mediterranean gas fields off the coast of Israel. So behind the political processes are who will get the future gas conduits out of the Middle East into the European market.
So it's still about oil and gas in the Middle East? I mean, is that those people who hold signs up at rallies, no blood for oil, and this is all about oil, and are they so far off the mark even today?
That's one way of looking at the current conflict. There's also a political religious equation, which asks the essential question, will the Shiite arc of control from eastern Afghanistan to Iran to now Shiite-controlled Iraq, thanks to the 2003 invasion, to Alawite sort of Shiite-controlled majority Syria to southern Lebanon, which is Hezbollah-controlled, Shiite-controlled, whether that arc will continue or whether there'll be a Sunni column down the middle of the Middle East through Syria, from Turkey to Sunni majority Syria to the Gulf Arab, to Jordan to the Gulf Arab states. Now, back to your question about Russia, what Russia fears most is that Sunni column will become a conduit for Muslim militants who have, in Chechnya, Dagestan, and elsewhere, threatened the security of Russia itself through their support of opposition groups. So there is a broader religio-political play, both within the Sunni Shiite worlds for who will control the middle of the Middle East, which is Syria, and for Russia and U.S. interests about who will control certain levels of relationship internationally in the region.
So take a moment and help the average American who's listening understand just what the heck this Sunni Shia thing is. And the way I've tried to explain it to people without explaining it is to say it's like the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland. Same religion, but different subsets in the same religion, and they've been fighting as long as they can remember. Is that accurate? Is that
The Sunnis and Shiites, especially led by Iran, have had an on-again, off-again relationship. So there have been Iranian presidents representing the Shiite community worldwide who visited Saudi Arabia. Khatami did. There were attempts to improve relationships, and I think as of this last year, Iranians are not sending pilgrims to Mecca for various security and political reasons. The relationship has been on again, off again due to local political, economic, and sometimes international reasons. Just like the Northern Ireland Protestant Catholic, almost 600-year conflict ebbed and waned, and finally came to a conclusion in 2012. A multi-year, 30-year peace process led by 600 NGOs working the peace-building angles resulted in the Irish Republican Army decommissioning its weapons and joining the political process.
Which was huge.
In June 2012, the Queen of England, dressed in green no less, shook the hand of Martin McGuinness, former head of the Provisional Irish Republican Army. And that was a triumph of peace building. And I know personally some of the people who were involved on both sides of that process, and led to the cessation of that multi-century civil war. I still think it's possible to do a similar process in Syria, but it will take a while.
And what was the key to ending, the IRA terrorism in places like London, where we saw people may not know buses being blown up? I mean, in
the middle of London,
just like
yes.
you see in the Middle East, you see the same kind of tactics being used. They were being used in London by, Catholics.
A professor from the University of Notre Dame, Scott Appleby, at the 10th anniversary celebration at the U.S. tax-funded institution in Washington, D.C., United States Institutes of Peace, at the 10-year anniversary of the celebration of the Religion and Peace program, named that it was, in response to your question, a saturation effort of 600 non-governmental organizations working the angles and historical dynamics behind that enmity that fed that civil war. Retired UVA psychology professor Vamik Volkan has a fascinating website in which he has worked the angles of what large group traumas do over generations of enmity, and how they can either amplify or de-amplify those conflict constructs that feed and maintain civil wars. So Vamik Volkan's work in Cyprus between Turkish North and Greek Orthodox South and various other settings has serve the broader peace-building community with sets of tools to understand how large group identities work over time. So that can help the Muslim Middle East right now deal with some of its challenges. Yes.
So you're optimistic about what we can do there?
Long term, not short term.
So if I hear you right, one of the takeaways of that thesis then is that the same structures and the same powers that can make the terrorism worse, that can make the civil wars more deadly, is the exact same structures and powers that can be used to create peace.
Yes. Religious discourse with political implications. Tajikistan was in a civil war in the 90s. The European Union supported various peace-building processes. One of them included the president of Tajikistan asking one of his literature professors to go into the mountains and talk to the final Muslim militant warlord who was holding out on the peace process. This guy walked alone, spent 2 months in the mountain, 2 weeks in the mountains, talking Rumi and Islamic poetry with this guy. And these were two Muslims who then helped end that civil war, and there's been peace in that country since. You can work the angles on conflict through strategic positioning over time, and there are people attempting to do that in Syria. It's not gotten to the saturation point of positive outcome yet.
My guest is Roy Hange. He has spent the better part of his entire adult career working in the Middle East with a number of NGOs. Roy, you said that you didn't think peace was possible in the near term. What's happening that you would draw that conclusion? Is it just worse than you've ever seen it?
University of Denver website, Political Violence at a Glance, says that the average civil war lasts 10 years, and this one began around 2013
in Syria,
the more militant phase of it.
Yeah.
And the average one will last 10 years. It's the violence phase. The Colombian Civil War has recently finished. Now, all of North and South America is at peace for the first time in a very long time. In Syria, I don't think it will finish that quickly unless there's an imposed peace that only Russia and the United States working together can somehow make happen. Because the conflict in Syria is so complex at multiple levels, international, regional, national, and local, those four levels are working to sabotage a solution at any one of those levels that would begin to, as it were, go viral with a cessation of conflict. So I've watched for at least 4 to 5 years that sabotage process happening at different moments of reactivity in the cycles of violence. My guess is the Syrian war will go longer, and there are other commentators like Joshua Landis from the University of Oklahoma that say this same thing.
So you don't think Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, can fix, quote-unquote, fix the Middle East, as we've been told he would?
All I can say is that there have been many who've tried with a lot more experience. I don't know much about his track record.
You said Syria is in the middle of the Middle East. What's your 101 for helping Americans understand the broader, bigger picture of the Middle East? You mentioned the ongoing struggle between Sunni and Shia, these different sort of like a Catholics versus Protestants kind of thing in Ireland, and there's similar things like this that go on around the world. But the broader Middle East, from Turkey down to Yemen and then into Africa, and it's a really big picture. How do we wrap our minds around it?
Most of the national identities in the broader Middle East come from and are deeply rooted in trauma narratives or trauma legacies or significant identity wars. That was the case in the founding of the United States within 100 years of the end of the wars of religion in Europe. Thomas Jefferson toured France and lived there, as did Ben Franklin and others, and they knew what the wars of religion over 30 years did in Europe, and they did not want that happening in the United States. So they actively attempted to separate religion and politics. So they weren't joined together to be a kind of reactive fuse to latent differences that are there in any culture. In the Middle East, religion and politics are fused in all the religious communities in the Middle East, and the reactivity to identity conflicts it's much more on a hair trigger there. Simply to illustrate, a significant part of Western Turkey used to be Greek Orthodox Christian, but in the war after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, most of the Greeks ended up in Greece, and the Muslims who were living in Greece ended up in what is now Turkey. There was a mass migration along religio-ethnic lines, and that's happening in Syria now regularly as local truces. We had a bus bombing just west of Aleppo 2 days ago that killed over 100 people. Those were being bused from Shiite areas, enclaves that were being surrounded by Sunni militants and attacked, into other Shiite Alawite areas that are of the same kind, while Sunnis from Madaya and Zabadani, west of Damascus, toward Lebanon, were being shipped up into Idlib area, where they're mostly Sunnis. So there is in Syria the transmigration of like religious political orientations. There's an effective balkanization.
It's like
of
India
Syria.
and Pakistan.
Yes, that happened in that.
Same thing
in that
happened
time
there.
also. But the untold story of that event was the work of Bacha Khan, who was called the Pashtun Gandhi. The same Pashtun tribes that are feeding the Taliban now had a significant peace-building leader in Bacha Khan, who led a 300,000-person red shirt army, built schools, and maintained a non-violent opposition to the British colonial presence. And he was a very good friend of Gandhi's. We only tell Gandhi's story. We don't tell Bacha Khan's story.
And that was in Pakistan.
That's in Pakistan,
Yeah.
what became Pakistan after the partition. But Marshall McLuhan, the famous media person's daughter, made a film about Bacha Khan.
No kidding.
Yes.
Wow. So you mentioned, we were talking about Pakistan really briefly. What about Afghanistan? Which is on the other side of Iran. And most Americans don't know that Iraq and Afghanistan bookend Iran, and that they're actually all pretty close to each other, right, in that region. Afghanistan. What's your read on that? How do we understand that? We just dropped the mother of all bombs, quote unquote, in the Trump the Trump administration dropped this bomb that most of us have never heard of.
No foreign government or empire, in my reading of history, has been able to control Afghanistan.
It's where empires go to die, they say.
That's one thing some of the British forces did there. Afghanistan can be understood as being pulled by four sides, with the occupying U.S. presence, or enabling U.S. presence, not necessarily occupying. But to the east, Pakistan; to the south, India. And India plays a significant, though more silent, role in what goes on in Afghanistan. To the west is Iran, and to the north is Russia and some of the states. So those four players still are active in what happens internally in Afghanistan. And the challenge for a way forward there is almost similar to Syria. There are too many regional players wanting a stake in the final outcome to have a reasonable solution in the near term.
In Afghanistan.
Yes.
I have friends who were soldiers over there, and one of them told me, he said, the problem is Americans like to think that there is a state in Afghanistan. We were over there fighting, and there's not even a state. There's no federal government. It's just warlords. It's always been. And I remember from my readings in graduate school in anthropology, that's what it's always been. It's always been warlords and territories and shifting alliances, and it's like the last place on the earth that you could see a state, because they completely reject the idea.
You could compare Afghanistan to feudal Europe, where there were a series of princes who ran their tax bases, or
Right.
villages around their castles, and who literally fought each other in the wars of religion that the Treaty of Westphalia in the end of the 17th century finished. And that Treaty of Westphalia set up the Western nation-state model. And it wasn't until that model was set up that static boundaries were assumed to be possible. Before that, there was always the threat of attack that maintained a sense of boundary. So there was a vacillating force structure that was dynamic, similar to a warlord model in Afghanistan. That makes for very unstable political processes. You cannot plan long-term when you're in a constant state of maintaining boundaries. And that's part of the political poverty in Afghanistan now.
And one could argue that Sykes-Picot was an attempt by the West and European interests to sort of graft the piece of Westphalia onto the Middle East at a time when perhaps they weren't necessarily ready for it internally. It wasn't a native movement.
I once had a meeting with a consul of the Indian embassy in Damascus, Syria, where I was living, because I needed a visa, and he wanted to know who I was. And I was going to India for a NGO visit. And we had a long chat over tea at the embassy, and he said, the British were a gift to India. We were a bunch of divided states. They gave us a common language. They gave us a railroad structure. We didn't like what they did to us, but they left something pretty positive for India. And this is a representative of the Indian government acknowledging the benefits of colonialism in India.
To create that nation state that is the nation of India today.
Yeah.
In a place where it didn't exist. It was just balkanized. And sometimes that balkanization can serve the interests of empires. They'd rather see a balkanized region rather than strong nation states.
Within the question of what could make for peace in Syria, I'm going to tell a story from India because I think that Syrians need to learn this. There's a professor of anthropology, Varshney, Indian background, who said after the Ayodhya mosque bombings and the tension between Hindus and Muslims that resulted in tens of thousands and killed in various cities, he said, I want to know why certain cities did not have catalytic violence. So he studied that systematically across India, and he found that where business and religious and social leaders said, we want to preserve what is good in our community, the economic vitality, the good relations, and the social inter-overlapping structures between our communities. We're not going to let violence happen. It was when those mid-level leaders were connected with each other relationally, cell phones and others, that they preserved the peace of their cities. It was when there was no, as it were, meshed network of interaction in a city that the mobs went after each other and destroyed whole neighborhoods and killed thousands.
So it's that old lesson that community leaders, individuals at the community level can change the world.
And this is my argument that I gave in Washington, D.C. at a talk in 2015. Iraq and Syria had such highly centralized governments that did not allow for civil society, the creation of that creative network of overlapping trust structures, because all trust needed to be controlled or understood from the top.
Right.
When you had the weakness at the center of, or the middle zone in the power structures in the society, you don't have a building capacity to hold peaceful structures.
You don't have the institutions of civil society and the community leaders from the ground up that make that kind of peace possible because they insist on it.
Yes.
Because they don't want to see their kids and their wives. They don't want to see the people in their neighborhoods being killed.
Now, when I lived in Syria, I will honor the Syrian government's attempt, even though it was forced at time, that every religious festival, Muslim or Christian or other religions, they would intentionally bring the religious leaders together, broadcast their being together and honoring each other's holiday and giving speeches on national television. They would model a cooperation, not conflict between the religious ethnic groups. The only group that really had problems as a significant minority in Syria were the Kurds, who often didn't even get identity documents, and they had a different status, which has led to their wanting to be more independent at this point. There were expressions of militant Sunni Islam also that were severely repressed under the Assad governments. If you went along with their national vision, you got to live in a relative controlled peace. And that's what people don't want to lose in Syria right now. Many see that there's a need for the Assad government to eventually transition into something else, but they fear that a very quick transition would lead to chaos.
Do you buy the thesis that I've read that that Putin intentionally engineered, let me say, this idea that they weaponized refugees, that we're going to cause so much disruption and war in Syria that we're going to send people flooding into Europe. And that will benefit our interests and send so many refugees into Europe. You get Brexit, you get that the far right wing in France and in Holland, and you get all of these people who like the alt-right in America. We don't want any more refugees. We want to take our country back a few decades, and we don't like all this change. And we certainly have seen so many people fleeing for their lives out of Syria into Europe.
My wife is German. I was in Germany last summer. I was in Germany the previous summer. I was surprised at how many more refugees I saw in the course of 1 year. And I can understand and heard from her relatives the shock of perceived as cultural invasion. I can't speak to Russian intention or, as it were, manipulation of that kind of process, though I can imagine that the Russians would have preferred a more stable long-term relationship with the Syrian regime, which they had before the Civil War started. And benefited from significantly. Syria was their largest ally in the Middle East, most powerful one.
Yeah. What's the legacy, Roy, of the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq and the destabilization and disruption that was brought about by removing Saddam Hussein from power, which was in many ways a cork in the bottle. And not only was the cork taken out, the bottle was broken.
Like Colin Powell said, if you break it, you own it. And the United States has both owned and tried to disown the chaos that has become Iraq. And one of the struggles is that in toppling Saddam Hussein without even being willing to follow the 400-page State Department-generated transition plan that the Pentagon said no thank you to.
Right.
They ensured by disempowering the Ba'ath Party elite who sort of ran the country and sending them basically back to their villages to farm, they basically ensured future chaos in the country because these people knew how to make things bad. And according to one of the scholars who follows Islamic State very closely, many of the core leadership in Islamic State are former Iraqi Ba'ath Party military and intelligence officers who came into radical Islam while imprisoned in various centers in Iraq. So we've basically functionally turned Iraq over to as a gift to the Shiite world, where there was a much Shiite majority, and there was significant Shiite uprisings after the 91 Gulf War. There was some Shiite uprisings.
But it was still controlled by Ba'athist interests who didn't believe in uniting church and state. I mean, they were secularists. And
they were. I worked closely with Syrian Orthodox Church and knew the Syrian Orthodox bishop from Iraq, and I remember him telling me once how Saddam Hussein gave his monastery in northern Syria $3 million, 3 million dinar, Iraqi dinar, for some renovation projects. The government would help all the religious organizations in a way that was not discriminatory. Iran now has a very close relationship with the Iraqi government. Iraqis are not Iranians. They have a very different religious structure in Najaf than the one in Qom, where I lived for a year and engaged in high-level Muslim-Christian encounter. But Iraq now is very close to Iran at some levels. And somebody I know who knows more than I do said the sixth floor of the Baghdad Iraqi intelligence is mostly Persian in communication.
That never would have happened under Saddam. Can you imagine that?
It would not have happened. But the problem is people in the region also feel manipulated. Looking from the bottom up, I remember watching Arabic satellite television around 2004 or 5, where an Arabic journalist was interviewing a villager. And he was standing in front of a bunch of destroyed buildings, and he said, "This is what happens when you don't have nuclear weapons."
And the message being, we need nuclear weapons so that America will stop coming here and dropping bombs.
Then they'll leave us alone.
It absolutely changes the calculus.
Changes the calculus for India and Pakistan.
And if with Iran now closely united with controlling interests in Iraq, which Holy cow.
So it's scaring the Gulf Arab states, the Sunni,
exactly.
the Sunni states.
Yeah, and explain that so people understand, well, what's the big deal if the Persians in Iran and are united with interest in Iraq now that we removed Saddam Hussein?
I have no affiliation or major sentiments toward any of the countries in the region. My main vision is to find a more peaceable way forward for all of them together to minimize death and loss of life. The reality for the Gulf Arab states is where most of the oil comes in Saudi Arabia is Shiite, not Sunni majority. And there have been various uprisings and struggles. The island of Bahrain, where the U.S. has a significant number of its forces, is majority Shiite, controlled by a minority Sunni government. And Yemen now is basically in
everybody's fighting in
attack
Yemen
mode by Saudi Arabia, fighting Houthi sort of Shiite splinter group
with our Gatling guns and our bombs and our jets. Yep.
And that is the humanitarian crisis in the region right now, and the death, starvation, and destruction is above what Syria is.
Let me ask you about Yemen, because I've been surprised that Syria keeps making the headlines, and yet we don't seem to be talking about Yemen. And yet, if you really look at what's happening in Yemen it's a bloodbath, and there's not two sides. Everybody's fighting everybody in Yemen. And I had a friend tell me, if there's going to be a World War III as a result of what's happening in the Middle East, watch Yemen. Just keep watching what's happening in Yemen.
About a month ago, a professor friend of mine who works at Peacebuilding Internationally, worked with the United Nations in a number of countries, spoke at the Center for Politics, Iris Sabato Center, where they had 30-some young political religious leaders from the Middle East being trained by a special State Department grant project. It's not a secret thing. There were press releases on it. So I got into his lecture, and I had lunch with some of those folks, including a young person from Yemen, who was talking about the leadership struggles inside of Yemen, just getting people fed, and trying to imagine how and when this war will stop. But this war is being fed by outside interests. And with the political instability created by Saleh's presidency's extreme capacity to control the divergent groups, but now that he's out of power, attempting to get back into power, the old corruption networks. The challenge is that they're basically warlords and various international powers creating chaos in Yemen. And to deconflict that process right now is very difficult.
Similar to what we're seeing in Afghanistan, right?
Every political government, including this one, needs to be perceived as having won any conflict they're in. So if the perception of winning comes only in terms of the defeat of the other, right, rather than the creation of a peace for the sake of the people, you will continue to have destruction. And that's one of the ways I've read multiple conflicts in the region. The need to be perceived as winning.
Holy cow. Boy, are we evolved from primates or what? It's just ridiculous. It's just it's an insanity. This continuing war, and to what extent, Roy, is the economy of war contributing to this? That people are making money off of this. And to go back to Jefferson, I mean, Jefferson and Madison wrote about this. That was, they warned, beware the warlords. They want your government, and they want to take this country to war because it's how they make their money, and they want to keep it at war because they get rich.
I'll say something that could get me in trouble, but I've done it before. There's a whole collection of Jefferson quotes on war and peace, about 10 pages worth. They're fascinating. They're worth reading, and they were removed from the online UVA collection of Jefferson quotes sometime in the 90s. I don't know why. You can still get them online, and I would encourage you to read them, because Jefferson's political acumen and the Founding Fathers' awareness of European history from which most of the early immigrants came had a heightened awareness of how religio-political dynamics can lead to a less perfect union. And so their vision of a more perfect union involved the separation of church and state and involved certain forms of human dignity and human rights that would decrease the likelihood of extremely divisive conflict and civil wars. And when this nation did come to a civil war over the issue of slavery, which was a profoundly unjust and abusive structure, the legacy of that wisdom of the Founding Fathers led people like Abraham Lincoln to say in his second inaugural address, "With malice toward none, we hold no enmity, on either side of that civil war, which cost 800,000 people. And his main general, Ulysses Grant, wrote into his will that I want generals from the north on one side of my casket and generals from the south on the other side of my casket at the day of my funeral, to symbolize the overcoming of that enmity that divided the nation. So if you don't have that kind of vision, you'll get caught with other visions. And that's why I honor the Founding Fathers, including Jefferson's vision in relation to the question you asked. He argued for the foundation of a nation not to be in a constant state of war, even though he founded West Point. I mean, I'm not denying the necessity of Jefferson's vision to found a protective force, but he had the vision of a nation not at constant war for economic reasons.
Because then you would have a nation that relied on war for economic reasons.
President Eisenhower and former General Eisenhower warned of the same thing in the 50s. It can be politically and economically divisive in the long run. Some economists have argued it's a kind of cannibalistic form of production. It's producing an asset.
A war economy.
It's producing an asset that doesn't add to the benefit of society long term.
Yeah.
Though it's very profitable.
So you had to be disappointed then to hear Donald Trump's budget proposal, which, is likely not going to go anywhere. We should point that out. But still, it shows you what the current administration in Washington wants to do. Take money out of schools, aid to the poor, scientific research, not create tax refunds, pay for tax refunds or like that. He wants to move it all instead into the war economy.
The Founding Fathers had a different vision, and President Eisenhower had a different vision and a very clear caution. I know that there are very powerful interests that would hold another vision. I've had ancestors on both sides of my family that fought in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War under George Washington, in the Franconia Militia in Pennsylvania. My roots go back very deep. I like what this nation is, but I fear what this nation will become if it continues to attempt to have troops in 100-plus countries around the world, and what that will do to us economically long-term and politically in the way it creates a resentment factor internationally, I am concerned about.
Yeah. And it's a complete rejection of the very principles that we were founded on. Certainly Jefferson and Madison, but even Washington and Hamilton, the military guys, would have thrown up their hands like that. This is insanity to have this kind of investment of troops around the world. As hungry as Hamilton was for his own war, with designs on the White House, but
coming back to Syria, General Dempsey warned Obama that if you get involved in Syria, you will be there long term. And one of the wiser points of Obama's positioning is how can we manage United States diplomatic, military, and other assets to both minimize destruction and find a way forward which would not involve more troops on the ground. There are about 1,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Syria now, mostly supporting the move against Raqqa. And combination of Marine Artillery, Special Forces, and other advisors. I don't know what will happen if there are a few more strange turns or a few more potential false flag attacks, which would increase a sense of the need for more participation. I'm not sure what will happen. I'm concerned for the sake of the United States not getting into the conflict far enough that escalates into open conflict with the Soviet Union, with Russia, excuse me.
Which, of course, Trump ran against. I mean, he specifically said, I'm your guy to bring these troops home and not get involved in these civil wars overseas.
And a section of his supporters would still have that vision.
Yeah, and are very angry that he is dropping these bombs and making these investments.
One of my observations that I've gotten the most head nods on, it is that the impoverished Rust Belt young men have, for the most part, served in these wars that have left them wounded, with PTSD, and with the bitter resentment of seeing that both presidential candidates in the last political election said that the Iraq invasion was a mistake. And so their losses were perceived as not as differently than they were perceived when they were actually in the conflict.
Yeah, yeah.
I won't put an adjective on that.
Right. Roy, what gives you hope? What should give us hope to try to put a bow on this conversation? Is it as simple as looking at people like Jefferson and Madison in those moments in time and recognizing that humanity has been in this story before? We've been here before, and we figured it out before. There's no reason we can't do it again.
What gives me hope is various Syrian leaders from different groups who have a vision for another way. There's an amazing young Syrian, I think he's still at University of Chicago, but he did a research paper on 5 different Muslim mosque leaders' Friday sermons during the beginning of the civil war in Syria, where they were challenging both sides to not escalate into a violent encounter and destroy Syria in a civil war. And he cataloged their speeches, amazingly accurate middle zone positioning from Friday mosque sermons, and most of those 5 were either killed, kidnapped, or silenced or exiled. There is the capacity among the Syrian people to find a way forward without a lot of international intervention and with a significant amount of international assistance. 3 weeks ago, I was with one of those people coordinating that from Lebanon. He was here in Charlottesville, Reverend Riyad Jarjour, former General Secretary of the Middle East Council of Churches. I've known him and his wife for years. He's working background processes funded by the Danish government, Norwegian government, to get people who are representing groups fighting each other into side conversations, not the high-level conversations in Geneva or former Soviet Central Asian states, Astana. He is working some background side processes. They're not secret. I mean, you can go on the website and read about them. But when you explore ways in which mid-level leaders can say, we imagine a way forward other than fighting for the next 20 years, and you can get them sitting together, imagining that, not at the high-level, high-stakes conversation where you cannot get the high-level leaders to move easily.
Yeah.
When you can get mid-level leaders to move into certain forms of communication from peace-building theory, that can eventually trickle up, like it did with the professor in Tajikistan and the Muslim militant who was there. There are ways forward, and there are people working at those ways forward at this point.
How can listeners now, whether they're listening to us live or on podcast, how can Americans make a difference? How can they contribute to that effort, a multi-year effort to bring peace to some of the most violent places in the world, where you've got a 17-year-old kid with a gun, and he truly believes in his heart that's his only option?
I'll tell a story out of my personal experience teaching a course in faith-based peace building for 9 years as of this May. I had 2 Liberians who were in my class about 6 years ago who were Lutheran religious workers funded by the Swedish government to work with former militias in Liberia. They told the story in class. The choice was given to captured militants from the other side. Do you want a short sleeve or a long sleeve? Your arm cut off at the elbow or the shoulder? That civil war was brutal. It lasted longer than it should have, but it was stopped by women who got a Nobel Peace Prize, Muslim and Christian women together. You watch the movie Pray the Devil Back to Hell. Lima Gaboe, who graduated from Eastern Mennonite University with a master's in peace building, Nobel Peace Prize winner for joining Muslim and women together to say enough. When you get mid-level leaders saying out of their own personal trauma, which she had to overcome through trauma training, trauma transformational work,
sure,
so to find her voice, she could stand before the president of Liberia, who was feeding that civil war, in a large public meeting between the women dressed in white, who would gather every Friday, and at the president's palace, and said, "We've had enough of our men and our boys and our daughters dying." She found her voice out of her trauma and led a movement of folks to stop that civil war. She got a Nobel Peace Prize for it, along with the current woman president of Liberia, who participated in that effort.
And that really is, let that be the takeaway of this conversation, besides the wealth and the treasure trove of information that you have so generously shared with us. Let the takeaway be that the efforts at peace, they work. We know they work. They absolutely do work.
South Africa, Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Eastern
All over the
Germany.
world and throughout human history. We've seen people who truly want to bring peace to a people, to a region, to a community, it can work. Roy, thank you for being here.
Welcome.
Thank you for all the work you do. Hopefully we can talk again. I'd look forward to that.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Koi Barefoot.